I would like to talk today about the study of ours about the variability of time experience in our Starfield environment. So when looking at time experience, there are two measurements that are often used in order to assess and in order to quantify time experience. Those are duration of time judgments and passage of time judgments. And before I start with the Starfield, I will give you a very short introduction into those two kinds of ways or to assess time experience. So in the duration of time judgment, we basically ask for how much time has passed within one situation, within one interval whatsoever. And humans are normally very accurate, or pretty accurate, at estimating the real duration of a situation of an interval. We are, of course, somewhat off in our estimations. We might be off by a few percentages, but in general, we are quite accurate. There is a bias to slightly overestimate shorter intervals and underestimate longer intervals. It's called Firod's law. We know of one potential mechanism that might explain how we derive at duration of time judgments already from Mark Wittmann's talk. He talked about that in quite some detail already. So we'll just mention that the pacemaker accumulator model is often associated with duration of time judgment. It is believed that during a situation, some kind of paces, internal events, for example, are stored within the accumulator. And when we then afterwards are asked for a judgment of the duration of this interval, we just look at the accumulator and how many paces are stored in there. And from that, we kind of estimate the duration of the overall situation. We know from some experiments that there might be ways to experimentally influence duration of time judgments. So some characteristics of stimuli like speed or acceleration or frequency of magnitude of visual stimuli, or of course the duration itself, have or can have influences on duration of time judgments. There are also task-specific influences like the fact or the question whether we ask participants beforehand that they will have, or whether we tell them beforehand that they will have to do time estimations, or whether we just ask them after the event for a duration judgment. And those are called either prospective time judgments, so when you ask beforehand, or retrospective time judgments. And it is believed that attentional processes, for example, have more of an influence in prospective time judgments, while in retrospective time judgments, we are entirely relying on memory processes. Other than duration of time judgment, there are also passage of time judgments. And in a passage of time judgment, we just ask for how fast does time pass, or how fast did time pass compared to clock time. And here we believe, or it is believed, that the passage of time fluctuates over a duration, over some kind of interval based on our current activity, for example, our experience of flow, but also the expectations we have beforehand towards this interval or situation, or our recall of the situation, and of course our overall emotional state. We know that passage of time judgments can be influenced by age. At least for older persons, we know for intervals of plus or 10 years or more that their passage of time is sometimes reported to be increased. However, those are judgments where we look at very long and intervals and significant parts of the lifetime. Therefore, it's also often differentiated between those very long passage of time judgments, and they are called retrospective or passage of lifetime judgments, as compared to judgments where we just look at much shorter intervals. And those would then be called present or passage of time judgments. For passage of time judgments, we do not yet have an established mechanistic model that might explain how we derive at passage of time judgment. There is this idea that we estimate the passage of time by comparing internal and external speed. Internal speed meaning the perceptual speed or processing speed, and we compare that then to the external speed, that is the speed of the unfolding of events in our environment. However, empirical data regarding this comparison between internal and external speed are still kind of contradictory. We are especially interested in the relationship between duration and time judgments and passage of time judgments, and we want to know whether those two judgments are just two different ways of measuring basically the same experience, or whether those two judgments actually measure distinct aspects of time experience. And regarding this distinction, we again have kind of contradictory results. We know, however, at least for intervals of 2 or more minutes, that the two judgments do not necessarily converge, that they might actually show different kinds of time experience. And that is also what we can find in clinical conditions. And David Vogel already talked about that a little bit. So in mild cognitive impairments, for example, or in depression, we can see that duration of time judgments are still very accurate, while passage of time judgments or the passage can be decreased. However, so far, we do not really have many systematic investigations comparing passage and duration of time judgments, especially investigations where parallel methodological conditions are used to investigate passage and duration of time judgments cannot be found very often. And there are even fewer studies where it is actually tried to experimentally manipulate passage and duration of time judgments. And that is exactly what we wanted to do and what we did in this study. For that, we used the Starfield stimulus. The Starfield stimulus was talked about quite often during the last couple of days, but as Anne and I just noticed a couple of minutes ago, we never really explained what the Starfield actually is. So let me start with that. The Starfield is a pretty simple visual stimulus in which you can see just basically a few dots moving from the inside of the screen or the center of the screen to the outside, maybe getting bigger or also brighter on their way. But in general, it's just a couple of stars or dots, circles moving. However, we use the Starfield because this kind of visual flow is known to be associated with the perception of time and the passage of time. So the Starfield is a quite useful instrument when trying to manipulate the experience of time. And that for several reasons. The simplicity of the Starfield is very useful in experimental and in laboratory conditions or under laboratory conditions, because we can simply change different aspects of the Starfield. We can increase, for example, the speed of the different stars or the density of the Starfield, or even spatial characteristics. For example, the direction of the stars. At the same time, the Starfield is quite immersive, although it is such a simple stimulus, and it is quite easily translated to a VR environment. And in a VR environment, it is even more immersive. You really have to try this. It's kind of amazing to be standing just inside this big field of stars moving towards you, or you moving through the star field. So what we did now was we compared, or we showed different versions of this star field to our participants. Just as an example, I'm showing two versions here. On the left-hand side, you can see a very slow-moving, low-density version of the Starfield. On the right-hand side, you see a much faster Starfield with a higher density. What you might also see is that the color ratios are different. On the left-hand side, we have a quite distinct color ratio with many more red stars compared to the other stars, or compared to the other colors, while on the right-hand side, this color ratio is much more balanced. I will talk about the reason and the background of this color ratio in just a minute. So before that, just as a summary, what we manipulated with the Starfield and as experimental manipulations for our participants, what we showed different lengths, different durations of Starfields, so 10, 20, 30 seconds. We have two different velocity versions, so a low and a high velocity version. We have low and high density Starfields, and we have more distinct or more ambiguous color ratios. And what we did now was we showed those Starfields, or one of those Starfields per trial to a participant. And afterwards, immediately after the Starfield stopped, participants were asked for a color rating. So we asked participants which of those three colors was predominant when the video actually stopped. So participants had to pay attention to the video until the end. They could never know when the Starfield would stop. And they continuously had to pay attention to the colors of the stars and had to update their knowledge about the currently predominant color. And after the color rating, we then asked for the time experience rating. We either asked for duration of time judgments on a scale from 0 to 60, or for passage of time judgments on a 7-point scale. We had 20 participants. Each of those participants encountered 96 trials of duration or passage of time judgments. And as already said, we presented different intervals, different velocities, different densities, and different color ratios. And the color ratios directly kind of transfer or translate to the task difficulty, so to say. What we found now was that, first of all, participants were quite accurate in distinguishing the three intervals. You can see that on the very left-hand side, the very first plot. What we can also see when looking at the ratio between the estimated duration and the actual duration of the Starfield, you can see that in the second plot, that participants tended to underestimate longer intervals. So when we look at the ratio, estimated duration by duration, then we can see that every number below 0 would mean an underestimation of the interval. Any number above would be an overestimation of the interval. So we can find a replication of Firod's law here. What we also found was that the passage of time judgments decreased for longer stimulus intervals. The color ratio, or the color scale here depicting passage of time judgments just tells you the darker the color, the more bluish the color, so to say, or purplish the color, the higher the passage of time judgment. We then looked at the effects of the speed and density of the stars, and we found that higher speed and higher density of stars both increased duration and passage of time judgment significantly, although in the passage of time judgment, the effect sizes were comparably bigger than in duration of time judgment. Although keep in mind that both of those judgments are done on quite different scales, and it is very complicated or very hard to evaluate whether we can actually, or how well we can actually compare those results from those different kinds of scales. So any comparison between passage of time judgments and duration of time judgments is always kind of complicated. We looked at the task difficulty or the effect of task difficulty as well, and there we did not find any significant influence on duration of time or passage of time judgments. However, overall, participants in all trials, we found a pretty low overall accuracy in the color ratings. So as a summary and discussion of this study, of this very first study, we found that the duration of longer intervals specifically was underestimated, and on those intervals, the passage of time experience was decreased. We did find that the speed and density of the visual flow specifically increased the passage of time judgments, potentially even more than the duration of time judgments. And that was not what we had expected, at least from based on the literature, where we just have evidence for influence of the visual flow of visual stimuli on the duration of time judgments. We did not find any effect of the task difficulty, but the overall accuracy and the color ratings was quite low, and that might have had a confounding effect, because an overall low accuracy points to the fact that the task was maybe too difficult, or at least very difficult for participants, and participants might have experienced some kind of frustration over the whole experiment, since they might have had the experience of not being able to actually solve the task. We also did not give any kind of feedback to them. So we decided to do another experiment. Again, we using the Starfield. First of all, we of course wanted to replicate the findings of especially the effect of visual flow on the passage of time, and its comparison to the duration of time judgments, of course. But we also wanted to have more control, or to better control the stimuli we used. So we did another experiment. This time we just varied the velocity and the density. It looks kind of the same compared to the very first experiment, with a few changes though. This time we had more control, or we controlled the color changes more rigorously compared to the first experiment. In the first experiment, the color changes appeared more or less randomly. Now we actually controlled for the number of color changes per trial. And we also made sure that the very last color, or even after the very last color change within a trial, there's still enough time to actually identify the currently predominant color, in order to avoid tasks being so complicated just because the last color change appears immediately before the actual the video or the Starfield stops. Yeah, so we had kind of the same, or basically the same trial structure as in the first experiment. We again showed different versions of the Starfield to stimuli. We then again asked for color ratings. And again, as a third step, we ask for experience or time experience ratings, either passage of time judgments or duration of time judgments. You can see that the questions here look somewhat different compared to the very first study. That is due to the fact that we conducted the second study as an online experiment due to the COVID pandemic. And you can also see that this time we asked for duration of time judgments as an open text question, where we ask for a judgment in seconds. And again, we use the scale for the passage of time judgments, or the analog scale for the passage of time judgments. We included 160 participants in the study, and we split those participants into 8 experimental groups with 20 participants each. So we had 4 of those groups had to give duration judgments, And 4 of those groups were asked for passage of time judgment. So every participant always just had to give passage or duration of time judgments. And within each group, we always only manipulated one of the 2 factors. So we either kept density constant or speed constant and then manipulated the other. So there was, for example, a group with who always saw low density star fields in either fast or slow speed. Or we had a group which always saw high density star field and then with either slow or fast speed, and so on. Each participant watched 20 star field stimuli in total, so had 20 trials in total, 10 slow or low and 10 high or fast trials. This time we did not find any significant effect of the velocity or the density of the star field on the duration of time judgments. However, we again found significant effects of the star field or the speed of the star field and the speed of the density on passage of time. When looking at a between subject comparison, we did not find any significant influences of the velocity or the density on either duration of time or passage of time judgments. So as a wrap up and as a summary discussion, to our knowledge, this is the very first systematic investigation where duration and passage of time judgments were actually compared under parallel methodological conditions, where we actually tried to experimentally manipulate duration and passage of time judgments, and where we had quite huge control over some very important task-specific effects in attentional processes. We were able to show that visual flow, specifically speed and density, can have a huge effect on the experience of time. And it seems that this applies specifically or might apply more to the passage of time than actually the duration of time experience. So we were able to experimentally differentiate duration and passage of time judgments. And thus we found an access to more systematic investigations of time experience under more controlled, under laboratory conditions. And it also potentially allows us to look at some processes and some effect that might be associated with different aspects of time experience. For example, some neurophysiological processes that might be related to specific aspects of time experience. Yeah, and with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions, your feedback. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mathis. Is there any question? Yeah, go ahead.
Cool. So I have a question. So you see that this Starfield experience change with the Starfield change your experience of flow. Would you have any expectation in different pathologies such as schizophrenia or actually bipolar disorders?
Not really. I would really like to see the results from different conditions as well. I mean, it depends on the condition we are looking at. From the depressive patients, for example, we might expect that the overall variance in the passage of time might not be as pronounced compared to healthy control to control persons. So there, the effect of the visual flow in general might be lower compared to control participants. The main problem, though, is that we do not actually really know how those results would look even without any kind of manipulation in, for example, persons with autism, or even persons with depression, where we do not really have many studies in which we look at both of those judgments under comparable experimental conditions. So any hypotheses about the effect there are quite yeah, it's more guessing at the moment from my part, to be honest, than actually being able to base those claims on any evidence.
Thank you.
So we'll give the possibility to the students to ask questions. So Julia first. And afterwards, there is a third question, no problem. Not only the students, right? Julia.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. It's kind of related, I think, to the first question. It was more about aging, because I think you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that aging patients have the tendency to see time being more faster than younger. And I was just wondering, kind of also related to the first question. I mean, do you have any hypotheses to explain that?
No, we did not find any similar effects in our data. And what I understood is that you don't see those kind of differences when asking participants to estimate, for example, the passage of time within the last day or within the last hour, or when you ask them how long did you have to wait at the bus stop or whatever. You just see that when you really ask them for how fast did the last 10 years of your life pass. And the hypothesis there is that participants, of course, do not really have a constant feeling of the passage, or they do not remember how they constantly felt or how they constantly experienced the passage of time over the whole last 10 years. What they do instead is remembering or trying to remember the different events from the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Thought that in older person, the percentage of your lifetime memories from the last 10 years is comparably smaller compared to the rest of your life. So if you ask a 20-year-old person for the experience of the last 10 years, then that's basically half of their life. So half of their memory is from the last 10 years. It has to feel very long or much longer compared to a person who is 80, and we're just, just 15% or a little bit less even, of their experience are from the last 10 years. So compared to the rest of the lifetime, it seems to be shorter. That's at least one explanation which is used to, or which is often used to explain the difference between those ages. So I'm not really sure whether it's actually the passage of time as we understand it that is decreased, or whether it's just more memory-based processes or effects.
Okay, thank you. I thought it was, I mean, using similar time duration.
Sorry, Julia, we are already late, so I propose that you can speak with Mathis later, maybe if
of course.
No worries.
But then we'll just give the possibility to the two other questions to be asked, and then we'll move forward. So Ivan?
Yes, thank you for the talk. You said that it is possible to manipulate the direction of the stars forward or backward, I think. And just for curiosity, I'm wondering if you know if there is any influence of stars' direction on duration of time judgment or perception of time, but passage of time.
The direction of the stars?
Yes.
No, I'm not aware of any of those kinds of effects, although we tried it in VR. So in the VR Starfield version developed by our partners from Würzburg, from Fabian and Maximilian and Jean-Luc, of course. And actually, the effect is quite interesting there, or can be quite interesting there, since you do not see the stars coming when, at least when we turn backwards, kind of, and the stars fly away from you, kind of. Then, since you cannot see the stars coming, it at least felt for me that every time a new star kind of passed me, it was kind of surprising and really a new kind of event. So I would, but that's more based on intuition than anything else. I would expect that this might have a big effect, although with many of those manipulations, it potentially has a very person-specific effects. Maybe we all experience those kinds of effects differently. Yeah, but other than that, I do not really know of any such studies or effects, but if anybody just knows of something, then please tell me. I would be very interested in that as well. It's a very good question.